There's a question almost everyone who's survived a relationship with a narcissist eventually asks, usually in the quiet aftermath, once the adrenaline of surviving has worn off and the deeper reflection begins. Why me? Not in a self-pitying way, necessarily, but as a genuine, searching question. Out of everyone they could have targeted, why did I end up being the one? What was it about me specifically that made this happen? Here's what I want to tell you before we go any further, because it matters more than anything else in this conversation. The honest, psychologically grounded answer to this question is not going to feel as mystical or as faded as the question itself often feels when you're sitting with it at 2 in the morning. But I think you'll find it's actually more useful and ultimately more empowering than a cosmic explanation would be. Because unlike fate, this answer is something you can actually understand, work with, and change. Let's start with what the research and clinical understanding actually tells us about why certain people become targets more often than others, because this pattern is real, well documented, and worth understanding clearly. Here's the first factor, and it's one we've touched on throughout this entire series: a genuine, deep capacity for empathy. This sounds almost unfair when you first hear it. The very quality that makes you a good, caring, emotionally generous person is also, statistically, a quality that narcissistic personalities are drawn toward. But understanding why makes this less mysterious and more mechanical. Someone with deep empathy tends to extend the benefit of the doubt further and longer than most people would. They look for the wounded person underneath difficult behavior. They believe, often correctly in most relationships, that understanding someone's pain is the path toward real connection. This quality, genuinely beautiful in the vast majority of relationships, becomes a vulnerability specifically around someone whose difficult behavior isn't actually rooted in a wound waiting to be healed by your patience, but in a stable, entrenched pattern that patience alone will never resolve. Here's the second factor: a history, often from childhood, of learning that love was something to be earned rather than something freely given. If you grew up in an environment where affection was inconsistent, where you learned to read moods and manage other people's emotional states in order to feel safe, your nervous system developed a very specific skill set, one that, as we discussed in an earlier episode on attachment, becomes remarkably compatible with exactly the kind of intermittent, unpredictable dynamic a narcissistic relationship tends to produce. This isn't a character flaw. It's an adaptation built to survive a specific early environment that later makes certain unhealthy relationship patterns feel unconsciously familiar rather than immediately alarming. Here's the third factor, and it's one that surprises people because it seems to contradict the first two: a genuine, demonstrated strength of character. This might seem counterintuitive, but narcissistic personalities are often drawn specifically to people with real substance, real accomplishment, real qualities worth admiring, because those qualities function as a source of admiration and status by association in the early idealization phase of the relationship. This is precisely why so many people who've been through this specific experience are, by any objective measure, genuinely accomplished, capable, admirable people, not because narcissists exclusively target strength, but because strength, ironically, makes someone a more appealing target in the specific idealization-focused way this dynamic actually begins. Now, here's something important to address directly, because I know the title of this conversation promised something that felt bigger than "here are 3 psychological factors." And I want to be honest about why I'm not going to pretend there's a deeper cosmic significance to what happened to you. Some people, and I want to acknowledge this honestly rather than dismiss it, do find real comfort and meaning in a spiritual or fated framework, believing they were meant to go through this experience for reasons connected to their own growth, their own soul's journey, whatever framework resonates with their own beliefs. If that framework brings you genuine comfort, I'm not here to take that away from you or tell you it's wrong. But I'm also not going to assert that framework as established fact, because I don't actually know that, and presenting it as truth would be dishonest. What I can tell you with genuine confidence is the psychological truth underneath all of this, and understanding it gives you something a purely fated explanation never could. The actual practical tools to make sure this specific pattern doesn't simply repeat itself with someone new. Let's talk about what actually determines whether this pattern repeats itself, because this is where understanding the real psychology becomes genuinely useful rather than just explanatory. Here's the crucial insight, and it's one we've built throughout this entire series in different forms. The three factors we just discussed: deep empathy, an early history of earning love conditionally, and genuine personal strength, don't disappear simply because you survived one narcissistic relationship and now understand, intellectually, what happened to you. Understanding a pattern and having actually rewired the nervous system underneath it are two very different things, and this distinction explains something that confuses and frightens a lot of people. Why so many survivors of one narcissistic relationship find themselves, sometimes years later, in a strikingly similar dynamic with someone new, despite swearing with complete sincerity that they'd never let this happen again. This isn't a failure of willpower, and it isn't evidence that you didn't learn enough from the first experience. It's evidence of something we discussed extensively in an earlier episode on attachment. The nervous system doesn't update its deepest patterns through intellectual understanding alone. It updates through repeated, felt, corrective experience over real time. This means recognizing the pattern intellectually. I know I tend to over-empathize. I know I learned that love has to be earned. I know my strength sometimes attracts the wrong kind of attention, is a genuinely important first step, but it's not, on its own, sufficient to prevent the pattern from repeating. Here's what actually is sufficient, or at least what genuinely moves the needle, and it requires being honest about the specific internal work involved rather than offering a vague, general suggestion to simply heal before your next relationship. The first piece of work: recalibrating what your empathy is actually for. This doesn't mean becoming less empathetic, which would cost you one of your most genuinely valuable qualities. It means learning to distinguish between empathy directed at someone's demonstrated consistent behavior and empathy directed at someone's stated potential or backstory. Real, healthy empathy responds to what a person actually, reliably does over time. The specific vulnerability we're describing today responds instead to what a person could become if only given enough patience and understanding, a projection built from hope rather than evidence. Learning to notice the difference between these two, in real time, during a new relationship, is one of the most protective skills you can build, because it allows you to keep your empathy fully intact while directing it toward people who've actually earned it through consistent behavior, rather than people who've simply told a compelling story about their pain. The second piece of work: rebuilding your internal sense of being loved unconditionally rather than earned through performance. This is slower, deeper work, and it usually benefits significantly from therapy specifically, because it often involves examining the earliest relationships where this belief first took root. The practical version of this work involves noticing in real time when you're doing something in a new relationship specifically to earn continued affection, rather than because it's a genuine, freely chosen expression of who you are. Over time, through repeated, felt experience with people who actually do love you unconditionally, friends, family, eventually a partner, this belief can genuinely shift, the same way we discussed with earned secure attachment in an earlier episode. The third piece of work: understanding that your strength doesn't need to be hidden, but it does need to be protected, with real discernment about who gets access to it. This isn't about becoming smaller or less accomplished in order to avoid attracting the wrong attention. That would be its own kind of loss. And it misunderstands the actual lesson here. It's about recognizing that your strength, your accomplishments, your genuine substance deserve to be shared with people who've demonstrated, through consistent behavior over real time, that they're capable of admiring you without needing to extract from you. This requires the same evidence-based patience we've discussed throughout this entire series. Watching what someone actually does consistently before extending the kind of trust and access that used to come far too quickly and far too easily. Here's something crucial to understand about why doing this work actually matters, beyond simply protecting yourself from a repeat of what happened before. Every one of these three qualities, your empathy, your capacity for connection, your genuine strength, are actually extraordinary gifts, ones that, when directed toward people capable of receiving them well, produce exactly the kind of deep, mutual, sustaining relationships that make life genuinely rich. The goal was never to diminish or armor these qualities against ever being used again. It was to build enough discernment that they finally get directed toward people who deserve them, rather than toward people who simply recognized, quickly and accurately, how valuable they were. Now, here's the question that actually matters most as we move toward the final part of this conversation. If this pattern isn't fate, if it's psychology, and if psychology can genuinely be understood and reworked over time, what does that actually mean for how you should think about what happened to you? Does understanding the mechanism take away any of the meaning, or does it, in a way you might not expect, actually give you back something more valuable than meaning ever could? Here's what it actually means, and I think it gives you back something more valuable than a fated explanation ever could. It gives you agency. If what happened to you was simply meant to be written somewhere, predetermined, part of a cosmic plan you had no real influence over, then, in a strange way, you're left without much to actually do with that understanding, except accept it. Meaning, in that framework arrives, but usefulness doesn't always come with it. But if what happened to you was the result of specific, identifiable psychological factors, your genuine empathy, an early pattern of conditional love, real personal strength that made you an appealing target for idealization, then you're left with something far more actionable. You're left with the actual levers you can work with, examine, and gradually shift, so that the same story doesn't simply repeat itself with a different name attached to it. This distinction matters enormously because it changes the entire question you're asking. Why was I placed in this person's life implies a kind of passive recipient. Someone something happened to, for reasons beyond their understanding or influence. What in me made this pattern possible, and what can I actually do about it, implies something entirely different. Someone capable of genuine change, genuine growth, and genuine protection going forward. Not because you're now guarded or cynical, but because you finally understand the actual mechanism well enough to work with it deliberately. Here's something worth naming directly because it addresses a real risk in a conversation like this one. Understanding the psychological factors that made you a target is not the same thing as blaming yourself for what happened. I want to be completely clear about this distinction because it's easy for it to blur together, especially for people who already carry a lot of self-blame from the relationship itself. You did not cause someone else's narcissistic behavior by being empathetic, by having a difficult early history, or by being genuinely accomplished and strong. Those qualities didn't create the harm. The harm was created entirely by someone who chose, repeatedly, to exploit those qualities rather than honor them. Understanding why you were a compatible target is about protecting your future, not about assigning yourself responsibility for someone else's choices in the past. Here's what I want you to actually take from everything we've discussed today, because it's the truth underneath this entire conversation, and it's more valuable, I think, than any explanation involving fate or cosmic purpose could ever be. You weren't placed in this person's life by some force beyond your understanding, working toward a lesson you were destined to learn. You were targeted, specifically and mechanically, because you possessed real, genuine qualities, empathy, loyalty, strength that made you valuable to exploit, combined with an early history that made certain warning signs feel unconsciously familiar rather than immediately alarming. None of that makes what happened to you any less painful, and none of it makes the harm any less real or any less worth grieving fully. But it does mean something important. This isn't a mystery you're required to simply accept without understanding. It's a pattern, and patterns, unlike fate, can actually be changed. If you find comfort in believing there's a deeper spiritual meaning behind what you went through, that it served your growth in some way beyond simple psychology, I want to say again that I'm not here to take that belief away from you if it genuinely helps you heal. Meaning making, in whatever form actually serves your recovery, is valid and often genuinely important to the healing process. But I also want you to walk away from this conversation with something concrete alongside whatever meaning you choose to hold. The actual practical understanding of why this happened and the specific internal work required to make sure the next chapter of your life looks different from this one. Because here's the final truth I want to leave you with today. The empathy that made you vulnerable is not something to extinguish. The capacity for deep loyalty and connection that made this relationship possible is not something to armor yourself against using again. And the strength that first drew this person's attention is not something to hide or diminish in order to stay safe going forward. All three of these qualities are genuinely extraordinary, and the world and the people who actually deserve you need exactly what you have to offer. What changes going forward isn't who you are, it's who gets access to it. Your empathy, finally, directed at people who've earned it through consistent, demonstrated behavior rather than a compelling story about their pain. Your loyalty, finally, offered to people who reciprocate it rather than exploit it. Your strength, finally, shared with people capable of admiring it without needing to extract it for themselves. That's not a smaller version of you. That's the same extraordinary person you've always been, finally protected by the one thing that was always going to matter more than any fated explanation ever could. Discernment, built the hard way through real roughly. Here's what it actually means, and I think it gives you back something more valuable than a fated explanation ever could. It gives you agency. If what happened to you was simply meant to be written somewhere, predetermined, part of a cosmic plan you had no real influence over, then, in a strange way, you're left without much to actually do with that understanding, except accept it. Meaning, in that framework arrives, but usefulness doesn't always come with it. But if what happened to you was the result of specific, identifiable psychological factors, your genuine empathy, an early pattern of conditional love, real personal strength that made you an appealing target for idealization, then you're left with something far more actionable. You're left with the actual levers you can work with, examine, and gradually shift, so that the same story doesn't simply repeat itself with a different name attached to it. This distinction matters enormously because it changes the entire question you're asking. Why was I placed in this person's life implies a kind of passive recipient. Someone something happened to for reasons beyond their understanding or influence. What in me made this pattern possible, and what can I actually do about it implies something entirely different. Someone capable of genuine change, genuine growth, and genuine protection going forward. Not because you're now guarded or cynical, but because you finally understand the actual mechanism well enough to work with it deliberately. Let's talk honestly about why this reframe, from passive recipient to active participant in your own protection, matters so much practically beyond just sounding more empowering in the abstract. Passive explanations, however comforting in the short term, tend to leave people waiting for the next lesson to reveal itself, waiting for some sign that they've finally learned what they were supposed to learn, waiting, sometimes without realizing it, for permission to move forward, as though healing requires first decoding some hidden message the universe was trying to send. This waiting, understandable as it is, can actually delay the very growth it's hoping to produce, because it treats healing as something that arrives from outside you once you've correctly interpreted your experience, rather than something you build deliberately through the specific internal work we discussed in the previous section. The psychological explanation asks something different of you, and it's harder in the short term but far more reliable in the long term. It asks you to stop waiting for revelation and start doing the actual unglamorous work of building discernment, noticing the difference between empathy for demonstrated behavior and empathy for potential, catching yourself when you're performing for love rather than receiving it freely, extending trust gradually rather than all at once. None of this requires you to first understand some deeper cosmic reason for what happened. It only requires you to understand the mechanism clearly enough to work with it, starting now, regardless of whether you ever arrive at a satisfying answer to the bigger existential question of why this specific chapter of your life unfolded the way it did. Here's something worth naming directly because it addresses a real risk in a conversation like this one. Understanding the psychological factors that made you a target is not the same thing as blaming yourself for what happened. I want to be completely clear about this distinction because it's easy for it to blur together, especially for people who already carry a lot of self-blame from the relationship itself. You did not cause someone else's narcissistic behavior by being empathetic, by having a difficult early history, or by being genuinely accomplished and strong. Those qualities didn't create the harm. The harm was created entirely by someone who chose, repeatedly, to exploit those qualities rather than honor them. Understanding why you were a compatible target is about protecting your future, not about assigning yourself responsibility for someone else's choices in the past. It's worth pausing on that distinction a little longer because it's one people tend to accept intellectually while still, quietly, feeling the opposite underneath. Knowing that your empathy made you a target doesn't mean your empathy was somehow the true cause of what happened, in the way a lock being unlocked doesn't cause a burglary. The lock explains how entry was possible. It doesn't explain why someone chose to walk through it with the intention to take something that wasn't theirs. If you find yourself, even after everything we've discussed today, still quietly rehearsing the idea that you should have been different, harder, less trusting, less open, I want you to notice that thought clearly and gently set it down. That thought belongs to the relationship you left, not to the honest psychological understanding we've been building today. Here's what I want you to actually take from everything we've discussed today because it's the truth underneath this entire conversation, and it's more valuable, I think, than any explanation involving fate or cosmic purpose could ever be. You weren't placed in this person's life by some force beyond your understanding, working toward a lesson you were destined to learn. You were targeted, specifically and mechanically, because you possessed real, genuine qualities, empathy, loyalty, strength, that made you valuable to exploit, combined with an early history that made certain warning signs feel unconsciously familiar rather than immediately alarming. None of that makes